This is the Superpowered Mind podcast for inquiring individuals who are tired of the struggle for peace, happiness, and clarity. I'm Claire Diamond, ready to help you explore the principles of the mind, the self, and reality to unlock ultimate mental freedom. This podcast is the one to listen to if you're ready to experience the capabilities of the superpowered mind. Hi, everybody. Today we're looking at a question which I think is perhaps one of the most powerful, humbling, and liberating questions that we can ever ask ourselves. And it's a question that comes into its full power in the moments when we are feeling resistance or resentment to someone, and also, because of that resistance or resentment, we want someone to change. We want them to change how they're being, what they're saying, how they're acting, what their behaviors are. And the question is, what is my equivalent? And it's a horrible question, this one. It's so horrible because in those moments when we're resenting someone, we feel like offended or angry or let down, frustrated by someone. In the moments when we want someone to change their behavior, we might look at them and think they're lazy or they're careless or they're unmotivated or they don't have what we have and they need to get it somehow. In those moments, the ego is having a field day, really. I mean, there's probably no more luxurious place for the ego identity to hang out than in resenting someone else and mentally going through the ways that someone else should change. There's full separation going on. There's this full sense of me versus them. There's this sense of me being better, more able, more thoughtful or considerate or more inclusive or more capable, more energized, more motivated. And then there's this other there that is not as good as us and they need to change. And so that's a wonderful place for the ego identity to hang out. And then in comes this question, which is going to become a default question. We are literally rewiring thought patterns so that that loop of separation, which is really a series of completely unachievable ones that originate in the idea of a separate, isolated, independent, choosing, doing me that is separate from the objectively true reality out there. And somehow I am going to find peace through that reality changing. And that is made entirely of unachievable ones. And when the ego identity is hanging out, it's hanging out in its full content, it's made of unachievable ones. In that moment, it looks like we are a separate entity. We are a separate individual. And so the ego is having that boost of separation. But ultimately, all it does is prevent the peace, the happiness, the freedom, the wholeness that is being searched for from ever being experienced. As long as the ego identity, that sense of distinct separation, that sense of me versus them, that bank of unachievable desires and yearnings, as long as that's running the show, then the search for wholeness is never ending. So this question, what is my equivalent, ends that. It ends that whole sense of confusion because it starts to open the mind up to the possibility that there is no separate me and separate them. There is no controller and doer as it appears to be. So in these moments when there is resentment or when there is this belief that someone needs to change and that they can change, what we can start doing is immediately go to the question, well, what's my equivalent? And it might be that these things are really tiny. It might be, like someone's just cut us up in traffic and we feel like pissed off, annoyed. And so we ask ourselves in that moment, the stress, that feeling of me versus them is a flag to say, ask the question, what's my equivalent? And in that moment, it might become clear that maybe even to that same driver, like a few moments earlier, we did the same thing to them. That quite often happens. That it's so direct. It's the equivalent is exactly to that person, the same action. I've done that to them. So, or it might be, say we're in a meeting at work and someone interrupts us, talks over us, and we feel that annoyance. And so in the annoyance is the flag to ask the question, and we say to ourselves, what's my equivalent? And we might realize we literally talked over that person 2 minutes earlier. It really might be so direct. And quite often it is, because the ego and its reality are mirrors of each other. They are made from the same belief system. So very often it's that direct. It's in real time. It's with that exact person, and it's the exact same action. Sometimes we might need to think a bit harder, and it might not be to that person. So say our boss gives us, it's 5:00 and our boss comes in with a whole load of extra work for us, and we're angry, we're fed up. What's my equivalent of this? And it might not be that I've ever given my boss a whole load of extra work. It might well be that I have. But if I can't find that, it might be that I've done that to the person who reports into me, quite likely. Or it might be that I've done that to a boss in my previous job. So the equivalent might not be immediately direct, but we can find it either with a different person in this sort of same period of time, or to an equivalent person, but in the past, perhaps. We can just let the mind roam around to try and see what's going on. Other things that we can start to consider is, what is the equivalent of the difficulty of doing this thing that we want someone to change in terms of their behavior? So maybe we've got a relative who is very unfit, say, and isn't doing any exercise. Maybe they're overweight. Maybe they're struggling with a health issue. And they're telling us their problem. And in our minds, we might be saying, oh, well, they just need to start running. They just need to start doing some exercise. And we're feeling very smug in ourselves because we are very fit, perhaps. This holds true for all sorts of things. Like someone might be struggling financially and we might feel very smug because we have our finances all nailed down and we're on top of earnings and expenditure, and they're not, and they just need to change their behavior. But if we look at the equivalent in terms of difficulty, then we're into something very, very interesting, because for that relative, we could think, so this relative is not doing any exercise, they're very unfit, they're really struggling. What's really hard for them to do? It would be very hard for them to even maybe go for a walk. That would be hard. For us, that wouldn't even be noticed in the vast amount of physical activity we do. So what's our equivalent of that level of change and motivation and effort that's required? For the relative to go for a walk, it's a big, big, big deal. What would be a big, big, big deal for us physically? And it might be something like a marathon, or climbing the 3 peaks, or taking place in, doing a triathlon event, or so, some going to Mount Everest. What is our equivalent of what we are wanting that person to do? And then it's really interesting because now we can start to see the effort that's required. We're now the same as that person. We're not doing these things. We might not be doing the triathlons and the marathons. We might be very smug in our level of fitness and recognize how hard it would be for us to do that next level of physical activity. It's the same for our relative. And when we start to tap into the essence of the equivalent, the true meaning of the equivalent, what really is it for us? It's so different. The mind is in such a different space of understanding and compassion, the recognition there's no difference really. Everything is relative, isn't it? Completely relative. And so that judgment of someone, that easy judgment, that easy superiority starts to lose its attraction, really. It's a horrible place to hang out. We start to recognize we really are the same. And this can be applied in all sorts of different ways. Like, for example, we might feel that our husband, say, or our partner isn't giving us enough attention. You know, they're tired, they're busy with work, they're preoccupied, and we feel that, you know, we're not the priority. We want attention from that person. And so in comes the question, what's my equivalent? And we say, well, you know, I am giving them loads of attention. I'm always asking them how their day is, you know, trying to find different things that we can do together, wanting to hang out. I give them loads of attention. It's their problem. They need to change. But then if we really get to the essence of what's my equivalent, so what is the equivalent for us? Our husband isn't giving me, our partner isn't giving me enough attention. What areas of my life am I not giving attention to? Because maybe it's hard to give attention to that area. Maybe there's a challenge in it. Maybe there's a risk of not getting it right, of it being, there being a vulnerability in it. And maybe we could so for example, it might be, the equivalent might be, I'm not giving attention to my work, or I'm not giving attention to my health because it's challenging. It's not comfortable. It's very easy to demand attention from someone else, but to give attention to areas of our life where there's challenges there, we can really start to see that. And so I would say, as a rule, before we ask anyone in our lives for anything in terms of their behavior change or things that we want them to do, ask ourselves, what is my equivalent? Really ask ourselves that. You know, we might want the kids to stop arguing. What's my equivalent? Who am I arguing with? I want them to stop shouting at each other. Am I shouting at them? All these things, you know, I want them to tidy their bedrooms. What area of my life isn't tidy? And it might be that my bedroom is immaculate, but my accounts are all over the place, or my email files are a nightmare of confusion. What is my equivalent? Genuinely my equivalent. Before we ask anyone for anything, let's do this exercise. What is my version of that? And let's spend at least 2 weeks, or until it's done, really, until we are actively doing the equivalent that we would ask someone else to do. And in that process, we can really see how hard it is. When we've really found the true equivalent, it's very difficult to bring it into reality. And so through that process, we become the same as the other person. We recognize that what we are is intelligence operating through a conditioned body that has beliefs, has fears, has needs, insecurities, has shame. And all of this creates limits, creates confusions and difficulties and obstacles. And to find our way through those, to really see what's going on, means that we become the role model for the change that we want to see. We're genuinely living Gandhi's words, be the change you want to see in the world. It starts with us. And the amazing thing that happens so often, so often, is when that area of our life changes and we start to really address for ourselves the things that are contained in it, the insecurities that it represents, or the limitations that are hidden inside it. They come to the surface, they get worked through, they get seen, integrated, behavior changes. And it is incredible how the outside world changes as a result of that. Well, I say incredible, completely logical, because literally what's changing in that process is the concept of what I am. So naturally, reality changes with that as well, because the two are made from the same subconscious foundation of belief and conditioning. And so as that foundation is changing, the entire experience of reality is changing. So these issues, these resentments and resistances that we have towards other people, when we bring in our equivalent, we act on that above all, before anything else, reality inevitably changes. And if the person is still doing the thing, then at the end of that, when we are really sure there's no hypocrisy on our part, when we're really sure we've cleaned up our own act, we can then say, please change. And only then, and this is brilliant for people whose job involves changing the behaviors of other people or their role. You know, I mentioned parents, or maybe teachers, therapists, coaches, employers, bosses, directors. Having this as an automatic way of essentially managing other people, managing teams, having the behavior originate within us is amazing. You know, if we're really stuck with an employee or a client, you know, a client comes in, say, if we're a coach, and we don't know what's in their way. You know, the client might come in and say, oh, you know, I'm so desperate to stop drinking alcohol, say, in the new year. And we might think, well, just stop. But if we think about the things that we struggle with, that we can't stop, you know, it might well not be alcohol, it might be something else altogether, but what is it? And the greatest service we can do that client is bring that change in for ourselves. We don't even have to tell them about it. We can just think to ourselves quietly, what is my equivalent of their problem? And we investigate it in our own lives. And it is incredible how that changes the people in our practice and creates freedom for everybody, because it originates with us. And when we stop using other people as a distraction or as a way of avoiding looking at our own behaviors, beliefs, thoughts, ways of being, and really allow it to be the right way around, that reality, all others, all situations, all circumstances are making transparent and materializing the inner, invisible, subconscious realm. And from that space, everything then changes. That's the design of it. That's the right way around. Incredible what happens then. So yeah, what's my equivalent? Let's have that as one of our phrases for 2025. Lots of love. Bye. Thank you for listening to Superpowered Mind with me, Claire Diamond. If you want extra support in the exploration of your mind, download our exclusive subliminal recording, especially for podcast listeners, on bit.ly/podcast subliminal.